Hi everybody, it's Terry Ryder from Hotspotting, bringing you our regular monthly feature, the live Q&A, which is your opportunity to throw any questions you have about real estate issues or real estate markets at me. Just type your questions into the comments panel that you see below the image you're currently looking at, and I'll do my best to answer it, whether it's about housing affordability, current finance issues, or whatever it is that you have as your most burning question about real estate. If you're like most people, you'll be wanting to ask me about locations, which is about 99% of the questions that I get on this live Q&A, which we have at this time once a month. While we're waiting for questions to start to come through, I thought I'd deal with a few recent events and reports that are relevant to the topics we might be discussing tonight. There was an article that came through in our research this week revealing the fact that the Geelong market, just outside Melbourne, which is one of the hottest markets in Australia right now, is likely to continue to be so for the rest of the year, according to some research that was published by realestate.com.au, showing that demand for property in the region, as measured by the number of people actually looking at property for sale in the Geelong region, has shown a 57% increase over the 6-month period under review. At the moment, according to these figures, that each property on the website for the Geelong region is attracting almost, on average, 3,000 views, whereas 6 months ago, properties were attracting about 1,900 views. So there's been an increase of well over 50% in the number of views that each property that's for sale in the Geelong area is attracting, and that suggests that we're going to see a continuation of the very strong price growth we've had in Geelong. Suburbs in the Geelong area have been, most of them have had double-digit price growth in the last 12 months, some above 20%. There's just been an avalanche of interest in that market, partly because of the affordability comparison between that market and Melbourne just up the road. So you can buy a lot more affordably in Geelong, and you can conceivably buy and live down on somewhere in the Ballarat Peninsula or in the Geelong area generally, and commute to a job in Melbourne, although many people don't, because there's plenty of jobs in Geelong. It's a very, very strong economy, one that's thriving and growing and going from strength to strength, which is one of the reasons why the real estate market there is as strong as it is at the moment. A question has come through from Mark, who's asking about my thoughts on Goulburn. Mark, Goulburn is a market that we track quite closely. It's been a feature in some of our top 5 hotspots reports of various types, particularly top 5 regional New South Wales hotspots in the recent past. It's not there at the moment, but one of the things about Goulburn, it's quite a strong local economy, diverse, but perhaps one of its greatest strengths is that it's so close to Canberra, and there are people who buy in Goulburn because it's a lot more affordable than buying in Canberra, which is quite an expensive market. And but it's, again, as I just mentioned about Geelong, it's conceivable to live in Geelong and commute to a job in Melbourne. Equally, many people live in Goulburn and commute to a job somewhere in the Canberra area. So that's one of the strengths of that market. It's also one of the things about the economy there is it must be a windy place, because lots of wind farm projects, really big ones, in and around that area, and it is a component of the local economy. Cynthia is asking about my thoughts on the Brisbane market. It's something that I've been speaking about quite a lot lately, Cynthia, because over the four years that Sydney and then Melbourne have been so strong in terms of price growth and market activity, Brisbane hasn't done a great deal. Individual pockets of Brisbane have actually done well above average, but overall the Brisbane market has been pretty lukewarm. And that's because the underlying economy has been kind of mediocre. Sydney's boom has been driven largely by the strength of the New South Wales economy, and Melbourne's boom has been driven by the strength of the Victorian economy. Those are the number one and number two economies in Australia for the last several years, whereas Queensland's ranked down around number 5 or 6 out of the 8 states or territory. But there are signs of it improving. The economy is definitely on the improve. Jobs are being created in large numbers again. The interstate migration figures are favouring Queensland again, and most of the population growth that Queensland's getting is actually funneling into southeast Queensland, including the Golden Sunshine Coast as well as Brisbane. About 90% of the population growth in Queensland last year was actually southeast Queensland. So I think we're going to see better things out of the Brisbane market, so long as you stay away from that inner city apartment market, which is greatly oversupplied, and we're seeing increasing evidence of values falling, and that's going to take a bit of time for that oversupply to be absorbed and that market to get back into equilibrium again. Amanda was asking thoughts on Armidale in New South Wales. Thank you, Amanda. I love it when people ask questions about locations that I actually know something about and that we actually have been researching, and Armidale is one of those. Armidale is one of those interesting regional centres in New South Wales. The regional markets in New South Wales are actually very strong at the moment. As the Sydney market's winding down, many of the regional areas are actually very, very strong, very active and showing good price growth, led by Newcastle, which is the market leader in terms of price growth, had phenomenal growth in the last 12 to 18 months. Armidale hasn't really done a lot yet, but it promises to do something. One of the things we like about it's got more diversity than many rural centres. It's not just about agriculture, it's also got a strong tourism industry and a big education sector because it's got the university there. Relocation of government department from Canberra to there, which is kind of underway. It was kind of influenced by the fact the local member Barnaby Joyce was the Deputy Prime Minister until recently, as we all know. I think that's still happening, and then there's some quite big infrastructure projects happening, upgrades to the airport, upgrades to the hospital. There's a solar farm and a wind farm, which are quite big projects sort of in the pipeline there. So prospects for Armidale looking quite good. I think Pepper's asking about rural South Australian properties, although I'm not quite clear what your question is. Perhaps you could just elaborate a little bit about what you're asking there. John, just let me just reposition this a bit so I can actually see it. I have a property in Gracemere, which has not been performing well. I've been cutting my losses and moving onto a more fertile market like Ballarat and Gracemere. I think are you talking about, John, the location not far from Rockhampton? If you are, yeah, that market has been through tough times, like many regional Queensland markets that have links to the resources sector. But I think Gracemere is a place where they built a lot of new product, a lot of new houses built there, and that market got a little bit oversupplied, vacancies were high, and so it's dragged down performance. There are signs of the Rockhampton market generally starting to come back. Things are starting to improve there, as they are in Mackay and Gladstone gradually. Many of those markets that have been through a tough period over the last few years are showing signs of recovery. But yeah, Ballarat is certainly a market to consider as one where growth is happening. So your money might be better there than in Gracemere, but the question is how much you paid to get into Gracemere and how much you would be able to sell for. And if you're taking a substantial loss, then it makes the equation a little bit more difficult. Mark asking about Morayfield, which is a suburb in the north of Brisbane in the Moreton Bay local government area. It's one, Mark, that we are tracking quite closely because it's one of the most active markets in the Brisbane metropolitan area. It benefits from affordability because many of the suburbs have got median prices in the 300,000s. And then if you go into the Redcliffe Peninsula, which is part of that local government area, many of the suburbs there are in the 400,000. So compared to places like Sydney and Melbourne, very affordable, good infrastructure, good transport links in many of those suburbs, including Morayfield, which has got a station on the train line linking into central Brisbane, good shopping, all sorts of things in its favour, but affordability is the biggest factor. And there are some major jobs nodes also up there, which is also an important factor. And not far from there, a new university campus is to be built down in the suburb of Petrie, which is a little bit further south. Roberto, my opinion about Baldivis, which is part of the Rockingham local government area in Perth. Yeah, well, like all of Perth, Roberto, that suburb has gone backwards for the last 4 years. It's all about, as you may have often heard me say, property markets are primarily driven by the strength or otherwise of the underlying local economy, not the national economy, what's happening locally. And while Sydney's been booming because the underlying economy there has been very strong, but the Western Australian economy has been very weak because it's so hooked into the resources sector, and the resources investment boom came to an end, and Perth found itself with losing population and high vacancies resulted. Suburbs like Baldivis, where there's been a lot of new product built in, say, the last half dozen years, went backwards, but so did pretty much every other suburb in Perth. But there are signs now that, generally speaking, the Perth market coming back. It's entering a recovery phase. It's most evident in the $1 million suburbs, the ones where median house prices above $1 million. We've seen double-digit growth in median prices in the last 12 months in some of those areas. It's going to take a while perhaps to filter it down to places like Rockingham, but I do expect it to happen eventually. There's all sorts of evidence that market, I mean the Perth market generally, is coming back after 4 years of pretty mediocre performance. What about Bathurst? Kelly is asking. There's a lot of infrastructure going on, new business centre, another racetrack. Do you think that'll help? Well, Kelly, anywhere where there's spending in infrastructure, that's a positive thing for property markets, certainly. And it's another factor that's resulted in the boom that we've seen in Sydney until recently, that the underlying economy is strong, but also very, very big spending on infrastructure. So in any market, if there's plenty being spent on infrastructure, that's a positive. So if that's happening in Bathurst, it's not one that currently we're focusing on a great deal. It's always a good solid market, Bathurst, but it doesn't ever seem to do anything outstanding, and not really aware of anything major happening there. I'm not quite sure, Kelly, whether you're asking because you're thinking of buying there or because you already own something there. If it's the former that you're thinking of buying there, I'd suggest there's probably better places in regional New South Wales and in Australia generally to be focusing on. But if you already own property there, Bathurst is, it's a pretty solid market. I'll just have a quick look at my ready reckoner here. Bathurst, median price about 380,000. According to these figures, the median price in Bathurst has increased 7% in the last 12 months. So that suggests that it's a market where there's a little bit of growth happening. It's grown about 20% in the last 3 years. So it's certainly not the most outstanding achiever in Australian real estate, but yeah, that's a solid performance. So if you own property there, at least you know that there's some growth happening. But it's certainly not. There's quite a number of regional towns and cities in New South Wales which I think are really good prospects at the moment and good prospects for growth. Probably Bathurst isn't at the head of that queue. I'd be thinking more in terms of Newcastle and the Hunter region, Tamworth, Armidale, Port Macquarie, Dubbo, Wagga Wagga, those sorts of places ahead of Bathurst. But if you already own property there, you've got the comfort of knowing there's been some growth according to the figures I just looked at in the last 12 months. Darren's asking for my thoughts about Melbourne. Well, Melbourne has had about 4 years of very strong growth. We have been predicting that that's basically past its peak and coming to an end. And we've done that by monitoring the sales volumes, which we do every quarter. And it's pretty clear that that the peak of that market has passed in terms of sales activity. Another piece of evidence that the Melbourne market has passed its peak is that the suburbs that are still showing the big growth and the big, really high turnover activity are the outer ring areas. That's always a sign that the cycle has almost run its course. People are going further and further out searching for affordability, and in the last 12 months, the biggest growth and the biggest activity has been in those more affordable areas up in the north around Epping, for example, down in the south west heading towards Geelong, places like Wyndham Vale and Werribee. But it's getting pretty close to the end, and the overall generalised figures for Melbourne starting to show on some evidence is that prices are starting to decline, although it depends where you look, because those generalised figures disguise all sorts of different things happening in different markets. There's still growth happening in those cheaper areas, in the outer ring areas, but not much more of the run to go for Melbourne. And what we're seeing, in fact, Darren, is that people, buyers in that general area, are more and more looking at the regional towns and cities just outside Melbourne. So Geelong's had a big run, Ballarat's starting to get some momentum, and some of the smaller towns in between Melbourne and places like Ballarat and Bendigo are also getting a lot of activity, and prices are rising quite strongly. And also down in the far southeast, outside the Melbourne metropolitan area, beyond places like Cranbourne, heading out to Pakenham and Officer, very big price growth in the last 12 months in those markets as well. So that's where the momentum in the Melbourne area is currently happening. So, excuse me, I just need to... Philip, what are your thoughts about the Illawarra region after the recent price growth? Yeah, it's another one of those markets that's probably had its run. We're talking about primarily Wollongong. It's a strong regional city with a strong local economy. It's done very well for its own local reasons, but also because of its proximity to Sydney and getting a bit of a ripple effect out of Sydney. But it's had a couple of years of that, and I think it's probably done its dash for now. It's always going to be a solid place to own real estate, I think. But in terms of price growth, it's probably had the growth it's going to have, and there's evidence of sales activity starting to fall off a bit. There was a time a couple of years ago when our quarterly surveys of sales activity had lots of rising steadily markets in the suburbs of Wollongong, but now they're all what we call plateau markets. They've passed their peak and they've levelled out at sales activity rates lower than the peak levels, and that's a sign that the cycle has almost run its course and the price growth has probably been largely had. But it'll continue to be solid. It should hold its values pretty well. It's got plenty to recommend it in terms of, Wollongong's diversified from being from the old days when it was like a factory town to a town where education and high tech activities and medical services and all sorts of other things are more important to the economy and creating more jobs. Tourism as well, of course. So Pip, you're asking about, I think, you've clarified, I think you're asking about towns in South Australia. There's not too many of them that you would sort of recommend that people rush out and buy there because there's such strong growth prospects. There's plenty of sort of solid places. The towns down around Victor Harbour, down in that area, are solid, but you always look at what's driving the economy in locations, and those sorts of places are primarily about tourism and retirement, and those sorts of places tend not to have strong long-term price growth. You need more industry that generates jobs and demand for real estate. Port Lincoln's a place that's had some good growth in the past, and it remains pretty solid, but no sort of big activity happening there. Whyalla has had periods in the not too distant past where it showed very, very good price growth and good rental returns. You know, when it's so hooked into the resources sector, that's the thing about Whyalla. And when the resources sector is strong, Whyalla's property market is strong. But since the resources investment boom went south, Whyalla's property market has also gone south. Vacancies are high, but there's prospects for it to come back because there's some good things happening there with the main employer there, the steel business. New owner says he's going to spend a lot of money expanding that business and creating jobs, etc. The one area that, and then you've got places like Mount Gambier and Murray Bridge, which are solid, but the one area that stands out that might have a burst of growth is Port Augusta, which currently is very, very cheap, medium price sort of below 200,000. It suffered because they closed down the coal-fired power stations, but in its place is coming a whole heap of alternative energy projects, solar farms and wind farms and other sort of hybrid, perhaps alternative energy projects. There's quite a number of them, and they all add up to $5 or $6 billion in investment. Some of those get started. There'll be lots of jobs in the area, and we're going to see prices grow from a very low base in Port Augusta. So that it's always risky buying in places like that where it's the economy is so dependent on the resources and energy sector, very volatile. But it may be an opportunity for people who are comfortable with a little bit of risk in their property investment portfolio. Caroline was asking, if you're starting out, would you start with negative gearing, looking for growth, or country with positive returns? Well, Caroline, I guess your question kind of assumes that you can either have good returns and no growth on the one hand, or low returns, therefore negatively geared, and good capital growth on the other. And I don't believe that's true. I think you can have both if you buy in the right places. You can buy in areas that have got growth drivers, so you're going to get good capital growth, and they can also be places where you're getting good rental returns. Some of the cheaper capital cities offer that. There are places in Adelaide, in Brisbane, Hobart, where you're buying in a capital city and you've got much better rental returns than you'll get in Sydney and Melbourne, but you've also got good prospects for capital growth for various reasons if you're buying in the right areas, but also perhaps more particularly in some of the regional markets. If you buy in the right, not all regional markets have good prospects for growth, but some of them do, many of them do. And if you pick the right ones, you're going to get much better rental returns than the capital cities, lower buying prices as well, but you've also got good prospects for capital growth. And keep in mind that places like the locations around Australia that have had the biggest price growth overall in the last 12 months have been regional areas like Geelong in Victoria and like Newcastle in New South Wales. So and they're places where, generally speaking, the rental returns are better than the capital cities. So you can have both. So starting out, I'd be looking for a combination of both. You can achieve both if you know where to buy. Okay, Thelma, what are your thoughts about Lavington and Albury? Albury-Wodonga, the twin cities on either side of the New South Wales-Victorian border. Really solid economy, one of the strongest regional economies in Australia. Such diversity, affordable, showing signs of growth in prices at the moment. Lavington's at the cheaper end of the market, so you're probably buying houses there in the 200,000, so that's attractive. Rental returns are pretty strong, so you could certainly do a lot worse than consider the suburb of Lavington in the Albury-Wodonga area. I think, last time I looked at some of the figures for Albury-Wodonga, it did suggest that there's some growth in that market. It's always going to be solid. It's such a strong, it's very strategically located. That's the thing about Albury-Wodonga. It's distance from, say, Melbourne, Canberra and Sydney means it's within a certain drive time of three very major cities. And that's why so many international and national companies have a presence there. They have big distribution centres. you know, some of the big retailers, for example. So it's certainly worth considering. Patricia, how do you feel about commercial properties in Sydney? Look, I really don't, have an opinion about commercial property. We're absolutely flat out staying informed about residential property around Australia. We have a national outlook. We research right across Australia, and residential property just keeps us totally busy, and I don't look at commercial at all. So sorry, I can't really help you with that question. Kelly, no, I don't have property in Bathurst. I was looking at investing. Okay, I'm glad you clarified that, Kelly, because I think one of the points I made was that if your interest in Bathurst is because you're thinking of buying there, I would suggest that there are probably better places to focus on. Not that there's anything wrong with Bathurst, but I just think if you're going to buy somewhere and you consider the whole of Australia market, the question you should ask anywhere that you're considering, is this the absolute best place I can buy in Australia right now? And I suggest that Bathurst is not the answer to that question, that there are better places that you could possibly buy. So, you know, the first thing you should consider, I mean, you're describing there, I think, an individual property. I think the most important thing to consider, first of all, is the location before you start looking at individual properties. Unfortunately, a lot of people do it the wrong way around. They go searching for property, they find something that looks interesting, and then they start wondering about the location. And really, you need to decide about location first, and then go looking for individual properties. So that's the order that things need to happen. But the very first thing that you need to do is be very clear about what your objective is. What's your goal? And then out of that, what's your strategy for achieving that goal? And once you've got that clear, then you can start thinking about locations. Once you've decided on locations, then you can start looking for individual properties. So, Kelly, I think you need to go about it that way. You may have already done that, but if you haven't, that's probably the way you need to go about it before you start looking at individual properties that you might get excited about, that you find online, for example. Now, we'll make you aware generally that if you need help with that, I do offer a one-on-one strategy session as one of the services that if you go to the Hotspotting website, you'll find out more about. Under the main menu, under mentoring, you'll find out more about that, and we could have a discussion about why you're thinking in terms of that property in that location. It may be that you could or should be looking somewhere else. Caroline is also asking about Portland and Warrnambool in Victoria. Now they're out in the west of Victoria, heading towards the South Australian border. Warrnambool's a good place. Portland's a good place. Interesting places, good places. I'm sure, you know, people who live there love the lifestyle on the coast. They do have some things to recommend them, but neither of them have been great performers on capital growth. You know, you sort of got to ask yourself what's driving capital growth. I actually received some material from someone who works probably in government in Warrnambool, basically promoting that area is a good place for people to perhaps go and buy or invest or live. Yeah, I mean, I'm sure the lifestyle is great, but what are the growth drivers that are going to drive capital growth? If you're thinking of investing there, over the last 10 years, neither has produced a huge amount of growth. Although there are things happening there, they're certainly not dormant places, but they just haven't thrived as some other centres have in terms of capital growth. Claire is asking about Townsville. I've actually spoken quite a lot about Townsville in the last few months, but I'm happy to talk about it again, Claire, because I think Townsville is one of the places that people should be considering. For example, we've had questions a little bit earlier about, say, Bathurst in New South Wales, Warrnambool in Victoria, and while they're good, solid places, the question you've got to ask is what's really going to drive them to make them produce superior growth. And they don't really have as much as, say, Townsville does. Townsville has got over $20 billion worth of infrastructure and other projects in the pipeline, some of them under construction, others coming up. Major things happening in that market that lead me to believe that there's going to be some really good growth in Townsville, with prices down because it's been going through a tough period recently in its economy, but it's really coming back strongly. And the infrastructure spend that's coming up suggests that that's going to be a growth market over the next few years. The proviso that some of those things actually happen, and some of them are hooked into the resources sector, some of them are the new sports stadium, for example. There's all sorts of things, expansion of the port. The James Cook University is always expanding, strong, diverse economy, so quite bullish about Townsville. Heath, what two properties? Goulburn and Everton Park, which are both making the point that they've had average growth. Yeah, I'm not sure how long ago you bought them, Heath. Goulburn, yeah, it's been an okay performer, but not a great performer. But I expect better things from it. Particularly because it's hooked into Canberra is one of the capital cities that's going to be showing some growth. Now, Sydney's winding down. Media keeps talking about Australian property prices falling. Well, they're not. Sydney maybe is, but plenty of places where they're not. They're actually growing to some extent or other, and Canberra is one of those places. And towns close to Canberra, like Queanbeyan and Goulburn, will get spin-offs from that. Everton Park, suburb of Brisbane. Brisbane's been a lukewarm performer lately, but we're expecting better things because the underlying economy is improving, infrastructure spending is lifting, population figures are starting to favour southeast Queensland, and the affordability comparison is causing a lot of people to consider Brisbane. So once all those ducks fall into line, we should be getting better growth, Heath, in places like Everton Park. All right. Byron, best suburb on the Gold Coast to invest. Yeah, I don't think it actually comes down to suburbs, one suburb better than another. It's very seldom is a case that when you're looking at a major city that one suburb stands out above all the others. That's why we tend to do our reports about local government areas, because you get a cluster of suburbs and they're all influenced by similar things. It's not a case of one suburb's better than the one next door. It's very seldom the case. If I was buying on the Gold Coast, the first thing I'd do is avoid the high-rise sector, because that market goes from one bout of oversupply to the next, and long-term capital growth is always very poor, if not non-existent. But some of the real genuine residential suburbs actually do show good growth, and I'd be looking. It's not so much the suburb, Byron. It's the like what's nearby. I'd be looking at suburbs that are on the train line that connects the Gold Coast to Brisbane, for example, and out there places like Varsity Lakes, where you've got infrastructure and jobs nodes and a good standard of genuine residential dwelling, whereas the high-rise sector, it's all about speculators and tourists and people with investors with short-term horizons, whereas those inland suburbs are about people actually live and work on the Gold Coast. And I'll be looking for suburbs that are close to a train station, got good infrastructure, close to shopping, schools and all of that, maybe around Robina, Varsity Lakes, those sorts of areas. The corridor linking the Gold Coast up towards Brisbane, like the Coomera area, there's lots of things planned there, growth drivers, but you've just got to be very careful, Byron, about, because there's lots of land there ripe for redevelopment, big housing estates, and sometimes they build lots of houses and suddenly you have an oversupply. But otherwise, that's a precinct to consider as well. Cynthia, what would you consider the best place to buy a house in Australia at the moment? Cynthia, I'd love to give you a straight answer to your straight question, but there is no one right answer to that question. There is no such thing as the best place to buy in Australia right now, because the answer depends on the individual. It depends on your circumstances, how much you already own, how much you can afford to spend, how much you can borrow, what your risk profile is. But to try and give you some sort of answer, I'm not trying to avoid the question. It's just that it's very hard to answer that question definitively, because if I had 4 different people in front of me asking that question, there might be 4 different answers depending on their circumstances. But I think places to consider, given that Sydney and Melbourne have, generally speaking, done their dash, and we're now looking for alternatives where we're going to see some growth and maybe offer a better level of affordability and better rental yield. So I'd be considering Perth as a city of opportunity. Prices are down because they've been going backwards for a few years. Now they're recovering. It's an opportunity to buy well. And then within Perth, I'll be looking firstly around the Joondalup area. I'd also be considering Adelaide, very underrated market. The South Australian economy is much stronger than people realise. It's coming into a growth phase, I believe, and I'll be looking in Adelaide first and foremost in the local government area known as Marion, the city of Marion, M-A-R-I-O-N. And Brisbane also has prospects. And then I'll be looking at regional centres like perhaps the Hunter region outside Newcastle, Ballarat, Victoria, Townsville in North Queensland. All those places have merit, and which is the best? It depends very much on you. If you'd like to discuss it further, as I mentioned earlier, there's always the option of the one-on-one strategy session that I offer, where we can have a 45-minute chat, and I can find out more about your circumstances, and I can give you a more definitive answer, because it depends on where you're at, how old you are, whether you have a family or whether you're single, how much you earn, how much you can afford to borrow, whether you own stuff already. All those sorts of things are a factor in coming up with the right answer to your question. All right. Sorry. There is a link actually just been posted by one of the support team to the strategy session. If anybody's interested in that, it's a pretty good opportunity to actually in one conversation, but it's a lengthy and detailed one, to get some answers to those sorts of questions that Cynthia's asking and get a more definitive answer, because it's very hard to answer those questions if you don't know anything at all about the person answering the question. What suburbs in Brisbane? Sean, I think, is asking, currently looking around the Bayside. Okay, well, first place to consider would be the Redcliffe Peninsula. I'm not sure if that's what you mean by Bayside, but Redcliffe Peninsula certainly is Bayside, as the name suggests. It's almost surrounded by water. So it's a lifestyle area which used to be considered down market, but it's improved a lot, and it's kind of been gentrified, and it's now sort of got a better reputation. It's now boosted by the relatively new rail link that opened about 18 months ago, maybe closer to 2 years ago. So that's worth considering. And then down on the bay in the Redlands area, there's it's a kind of the forgotten part of the Brisbane market, really. It doesn't get talked about much, but I think it's got good prospects. For what it offers, properties down by the bay. Moreton Bay is a very beautiful area with, wonderful islands like Moreton Island and the Stradbroke Islands just off the coast there. Great lifestyle down there, and it doesn't get talked about much. And for what it offers, it's quite affordable, and there's some infrastructure spending coming up that would perhaps improve prospects for growth. So worth considering, I think. But first and foremost, waterside Brisbane, I'd be thinking about the Redcliffe Peninsula, where many of the suburbs have median prices in the 400,000s, and you've got the new rail link, and there's some major jobs nodes nearby, like around the airport and the seaport. So you're not necessarily commuting to central Brisbane to work. Okay. Mel, Ipswich is recording 5% growth. Yeah, I'm not sure that's correct. I mean, depends whose figures you look. I mean, I think the first thing you've got to understand is that all real estate data is dodgy to a certain degree. And if you're asking for a growth figure for Ipswich, if you got a growth figure from 4 different research companies, you probably get 4 different figures. That's one of the things I try to point out to people, particularly in the Ryder report, which is our monthly newsletter that you can subscribe to on the Hotspotting website. But I often compare in a table growth for the major cities in the last 12 months from, say, 3 or 4 different sources, and they're quite different numbers. Ipswich hasn't shown a lot of growth, generally speaking, in the last few years. It has in the past. It's been an outstanding growth performer going back, say, between 5 to 10 years ago. Then it's going for a bit of a lull, like a lot of Brisbane, now showing signs of coming back. It's got good prospects for growth. Now, I think that's the most important thing. Not so much what it's done in the recent past, but what it might do in the near future. That's the important thing. Ipswich is probably the most affordable part of the Brisbane metropolitan market. It's got plenty of affordable real estate. It's got some pretty good transport links, good infrastructure, major projects happening, major jobs nodes. A lot of companies set up out in Ipswich, particularly industrial commercial type companies, because the land is cheap and they can establish their big premises, and also the transport links when they will be sort of trucking things to other parts of Australia are pretty good out there. And you've got things like the $5 billion defence contract recently announced, which is going to be happening out there as well. So there's plenty of reasons to consider Ipswich for future growth. So certainly not to be discounted. Now, question, would you recommend Caboolture over Petrie? Which are both up down that Moreton Bay region we've talked about a little bit earlier. So Caboolture is one of the main suburbs, one of the sort of like CBD type suburbs of the Moreton Bay region. And then Petrie's a little bit further south. Look, again, you can make arguments for both. Caboolture is, like I said, it's sort of like a mini CBD in the north. Lots of shopping and government offices and various good infrastructure. Very affordable, that area. It's considered down market, and some people sort of poo-poo it because some people are real estate snobs and say, why would you want to live there? Well, lots of people do, because it's got all those qualities I just mentioned, including affordability. And there's some good jobs nodes up there and transport links. It's on the main highway. It's on the rail line. So plenty of good reasons to consider Caboolture as investment. Petrie is a little bit more expensive, but still, compared to, say, Sydney and Melbourne, very affordable. Median house price in the low 400,000s. I discovered when I checked it, I think only yesterday, in fact, for a particular reason. And a couple of things about Petrie. It's where you've got the rail line coming out, where the new branch of the rail line that goes out to the Redcliffe Peninsula, that's where the lines separate at Petrie. So it's kind of a train transport hub. And the other big feature is that's where the new university campus is going to go at Petrie. And so it's pretty certain that's going ahead. It's not just a vision. The land's bought, there's money allocated. They expect that to be, the early stage of that university campus to be up and running in a couple of years. So it's going to create a lot of rental demand in that area. So depending on how much you want to spend, if you want to spend a little bit more, then Petrie would be one to go for, I think. But if you've got a tighter budget, then Caboolture's also got things to recommend it. Yeah. So, Michael, what are your thoughts on Bedford in Western Australia? Do you see upside in this area? Yeah, Michael, if you could just perhaps put in another entry, just give me an idea exactly where in Perth that is. I mean, generally speaking, Perth is on a recovery mode, and I think Perth generally is going to be showing some growth for the first time in, say, 4 or 5 years. As I said earlier, when you're asking about an individual suburb, there's no particular reason why one suburb is going to grow and others aren't, or one suburb is going to do a whole lot better. Precincts, perhaps some clusters of suburbs have better prospects because of what's happening there or where they're located. But I just can't quite place Bedford. So if you give me an idea of exactly where it is, I can give you, Michael, a better answer, other than a general one that Perth's on the way back, and expect Perth prices generally to start rising. Okay, Kate. Thanks for the feedback, Kate. What do you think about renting out share houses to students near? Yeah. So we're looking at, maybe near Wollongong University, Wollongong, Federation University in Ballarat. Yeah, I mean, Kate, I don't really have a strong view about that. I mean, I understand that if you sort of rent, you can get a better return and more income off a property if you sort of rent it out room by room, I suppose. So, a number of people are doing that. It's not something I've done, and so I'm not quite sure about the pros and cons of doing it that way, as opposed to sort of just renting out to one tenant and they find their own flatmates. But it seems that it's a strategy that some people do advocate because you can get more per room that way, and so you increase your rental return. Not sure what the downside of that might be. Rory, the Gympie area, house and land releases, yeah. Okay, well, Gympie generally, Rory, is a place that we have in our top 5 regional Queensland hotspots report for a number of reasons. It's very close to the Sunshine Coast, which is a very strongly growing economy, and Gympie is benefiting because there have been major improvements to the main highway, which you would drive down. If you've lived in Gympie and working on the Sunshine Coast, the links between the two have improved a lot. But Gympie's a lot more affordable than most suburbs on the Sunshine Coast, so you can buy cheaper in Gympie and then commute down the highway to a job on the Sunshine Coast where the economy is growing and jobs are being created. So Gympie is benefiting from that. There's a few local things happening as well. It's got things to recommend in its own right. House and land releases. Generally, I tend more towards buying existing houses rather than new product. But again, it depends on your own circumstances, what you like and what you don't like. Buying new has advantages. There may be disadvantages. I personally prefer something that's modern but not brand new, maybe 5 to 10 years old, which is so you're still getting a modern dwelling, which if it's, you get it checked out by building and pest inspector, of course, but you should have a few maintenance worries for something that young. But if you're buying brand new, quite often you're buying at a high price. You're paying developers' profit and the marketing fees, etc., etc. So certainly consider the Gympie area for the reasons I said, Rory, but not necessarily buying a new house and land package unless there's some compelling reason for you to do so. Michael has come back with a little bit more in the Bayswater catchment. Yeah, generally, just let me check something, Michael, so I can maybe give you an answer. I just need to check in my ready reckoning here, if you'll excuse me a moment. Just take me a minute to find Bedford. Yeah, I kind of had that, where I had it sort of, the sort of market I thought it was, it's kind of what you might call middle market. Not at the top end, not the $1 million suburbs, median house price around 600,000. Those sort of, I guess, a middle ring area of Perth. Yeah, I think that's pretty solid. What we've seen so far, like on the Perth market as evidence that market's coming back, is that it's noticeable that the $1 million suburbs, the ones at the top end of the market where the median house price is above $1 million, that many of those suburbs in Perth have actually had growth in their median prices in the last 12 months of more than 10%. Now, if it was just one or two, it could be a statistical aberration. When there's a whole lot of them, you start to believe something's happening. So that's what normally happens, that an upcycle starts at the top end and then it ripples out to the middle ring suburbs and later to the outer suburbs. So on that basis, there's reason to believe that sort of middle market areas like Bedford could soon be coming into a period of growth. Let me just look at that figure again and see if there's any hint from these figures about what's happened recently for Bedford. According to these figures, actually, the median price has grown 3% in the last 12 months. Well, not too many areas of Perth have had growth apart from those $1 million suburbs. So the fact that it's in the positive is a good sign, because many Perth suburbs are still a little bit in the negative as they sort of get to the bottom of the cycle and start to rise again. So yeah, it's probably worth considering. But the factors I'd look for, considering Perth, where would you buy? Well, it's what qualities does the individual area you're looking at have? Is it on the train line? Does it have good transport links to other parts of Perth? Are there schools and shopping centres in the area? Are there, close to major jobs nodes? All of those things. Those are the things to consider. You can sort of tick all those boxes, and you can afford to buy in an area where the median price is a bit over 600,000. Then it's certainly worth considering. Roy has come back about Gympie, pointing out the new freeway completed a year early, very underpinned by business, close to the Sunshine Coast. Yeah, well, all that's true. That's why we've actually included Gympie in the current edition of Top 5 Regional Queensland Hotspots. There's those links to the Sunshine Coast, its relative affordability, and some of the things that are happening locally, improved infrastructure, including the highway links that you mentioned, Rory. Okay. Angus, what about the Ripley area for investment area? So you're talking, Ripley is a new growth area out in Ipswich City in the southwestern fringe of the Brisbane metropolitan area. I actually having a discussion with somebody the other day about the relative merits between, say, Ripley and Springfield, and the thing I liked about Springfield is it's more established. They're both sort of master plan community areas, but Springfield's been going for much longer. It's now got a train station with rail links to central Brisbane, as well as a lot of established infrastructure, whereas Ripley is a new development area. It's sort of south of the Ipswich CBD. Probably its proximity to the RAF Amberley base might be a benefit, given that it's a major jobs node, one that's expanding all the time. Lots of money being spent there by the federal government. So that's in its favour. But I think generally I'd prefer somewhere like the Springfield area, more established. It's got the rail links. Ripley's got a lot of land available for new development. There's a potential there for lots of new product to come into the market and perhaps create an oversupply. That's always a risk in those new development areas. So I think, I certainly wouldn't discount it, Angus, but I think probably there's areas in Ipswich City that I would prefer to the Ripley area. Okay, But this question is about is this a good time to jump into the Perth apartment market? Okay, now we're looking at a Mervic project, North Fremantle. Look, I like Fremantle, there's no doubt about that. But in terms of the apartment market, just be very careful if you're looking at investing in Perth. I'm just not sure whether I'd be going for the apartment market. It's been a very tough market recently because they built too much and there's been high vacancies. I mean, vacancies have been high in Perth, generally speaking, but more so in those sort of inner city apartment markets. You just need to consider the reasons why you're considering buying an apartment. Are you buying to live in for that lifestyle or for an investment? The buying may be good at the moment because of what the Perth market's been doing in the last few years, and prices are down, and maybe a project that we can get a bargain perhaps, and that gives you a head start on capital growth for the future. That Fremantle area certainly has got good lifestyle features, good locational features. So in that respect, it's worth considering. But I just weigh up the pros and cons between an apartment and a house on land. Of course, affordability is another factor. You can buy more cheaply with an apartment. So that needs to be considered as well. Philip, again, if you have between 300,000 and 360,000 to spend, to buy another investment property with good rental returns, good potential growth, which region would you buy in first and why? Another one of those rather challenging questions because, the answer depends on the individual. I keep coming back to that, but it's true. It depends on what you already own and where do you own it. But you're putting that aside, okay? 300 to 360,000, and you want a good rental return, good potential for growth. Which region would you buy in? I'd consider Ballarat in Victoria. Strong regional city, well connected to Melbourne. Certainly you can buy pretty well in that price range, get pretty good rental returns, and that market is growing for sure. So that would be on my list, on my short list. There are places in Brisbane and in Adelaide that would answer those criteria with good prospects for growth, good rental returns, buying well-located property close to jobs nodes, good infrastructure. Yeah. My short list would include the Brisbane metro area, the Adelaide metro area, and regional areas like Ballarat, the ones that spring instantly to mind. If I thought about it for longer, I'd come up with others, I'm sure. Angus, what about the Strathpine area in Queensland? Or what area in Queensland you recommend, for example, Cairns? Well, if we're talking North Queensland, I'd prefer Townsville to Cairns. Cairns has got its merits too, but I think Townsville's got better prospects, more diverse economy, and the infrastructure spend there is coming up quite huge. So that's one part of your question. Strathpine area, well, it's part of that northern Brisbane, Moreton Bay local government area, up near Petrie, which I discussed earlier. So not so much Strathpine per se, but that general area I think has lots of potential. And I'd be looking in the Moreton Bay local government area. I'd look at around the Caboolture area for all the infrastructure and affordability. I look around Petrie because it's quite affordable. New university campus going there, close to North Lakes with all its amenities, and I'd consider the Redcliffe Peninsula for its lifestyle, its new rail links and affordability. So there's more than one precinct. There's nothing particular about Strathpine that stands out for me, but those general areas in the Moreton Bay local government area all have plenty to recommend them. Okay. So let me just check on the time. I've been talking for so long, I've completely lost track of it. My God, we've been going for an hour already. Doesn't time fly when you're busy talking and answering lots of questions? Keep the questions coming in. Just remind you that if there's a particular area you're interested in, I can give you a short answer to a question. What about this area? What about some other area. But if you're thinking seriously about buying there, you really do need to have more than a one paragraph answer to a one sentence question. You need to do more research, obviously. And we have a particular focus on location reports on the hotspotting website. You can go there, check out the location reports page. We don't cover all areas of Australia, but we're gradually building our stable of location reports. Most of them are areas that we feel are worth considering. We're less likely to do a report on an area that we don't rate, but there's also special reports on some areas that have particular interest about markets like Gladstone that have been down and people are asking when's it going to come back, or the coal mining town of Warrnambool is another one, or Darwin is another market that people often ask about because people have bought property there when times are good and then find that it's lost value and want to know when's it coming back. So we have reports on those sorts of areas as well, and you might find for a pretty low price for a location report, you can find out a lot more, save you a lot of time, because if you've got to thoroughly research an area, as you should before you buy there, it can be very time consuming, and our reports can certainly make it a lot easier for you by providing a lot of essential information. That means that by outlaying $55 for a local location report, you're saving yourself a lot of research time. And the other thing that might be of use and of interest to you, some of the questions that people ask, particularly some of those more general ones where people are asking, where's the best place for me to buy? If I had $350,000, where do you think I should buy? And my answer in broad terms is that it depends on you, the individual. And before I can answer, I need to know more about you and your circumstances. And that can be achieved in the strategy sessions. That there's a link posted there, what many of you are looking at. You'll be able to see the link to the strategy session service that I provide, where we can have a conversation, a detailed conversation to answer some of those sorts of questions. And I think it's really important to put the answers to questions like that in the context of where you're at, you know, how old you are, your family situation, how much you earn, how much you already own, what your goals and objectives are, etc. And then actually start to provide answers that are meaningful and worth having. Okay. Okay, so Kelly, sorry, the screen keeps moving as I'm trying to read what you're saying. Kelly, so I'm thinking Armidale. I'm really not sure about what Gina Reinhardt's doing in that area at the moment, but I do think that you mentioned Tamworth and Armidale. They're both worth considering. I mean, they're strong regional centres and they have diversity to their economy, more so than most sort of rural locations. You know, they offer great affordability, pretty good rental yields. They're growing in their populations. You know, there's all sorts of reasons to consider those places. They're unlikely to get boom time growth in those places, Kelly, but they can be very steady performers, safe places to own, affordable to buy into, good rental returns, safe and steady. And for some people, that's really valuable. You know, boom type locations can be very volatile, and you can have big growth and then the market turns and you actually lose value, like people experienced in places like Gladstone and other parts of regional Queensland over the last 5 years. So, yeah. Miriam, do you think there'll be more growth in the Seaford house market, southeast Melbourne? Yeah, well, like, I think, Miriam, that Melbourne's had most of the growth it's going to have. There may be a little bit more in those more outlying areas. I think Seaford's, is sort of down towards Frankston from memory. But I think most of the growth that Melbourne's going to have has been had. It's close to the end of its cycle. Some of those outlying areas are still having good activity and some growth, but I don't think there's much more to go, because it's been 4 strong years, and the generalised figures are now starting to indicate perhaps values are starting to turn down, or that's probably more in the more expensive property, sort of dragging that down. The outlying area is still pretty solid, but I think if you again, it depends. Are you asking the question because you own something there and want to know how is it going to grow some more, or you're thinking of buying there? If you're thinking the Melbourne area, I'll perhaps be looking regional, a little bit outside Melbourne. That's where the population trends are heading. It's a very strong population trend. People out of Melbourne moving to regional towns and cities, still very close to Melbourne, and the reasons are probably obvious. More affordable, different lifestyle, but you can still stay connected to Melbourne. You can still commute to a job in Melbourne, perhaps. And those are the sorts of areas where the growth is sort of rippling out to now. So that's where I'd be looking if it's investment you're looking for, rather than perhaps a suburb of Melbourne, which has already had some pretty amazing growth, generally speaking, in the last 3 or 4 years. Okay, so I think I've answered pretty much all the questions that have come in to date. We've been going for about 1 hour and 10 minutes, and that might be, an opportune time to bring matters to a halt. Thank you all for your questions and your comments. Some of those of you who put in positive feedback, or thank me for the answers I've given tonight. I certainly do my best to answer as directly as I can. Sometimes I'm asked a question about an area that I don't have intimate knowledge of. You're always welcome to follow up with perhaps an email, and if you've got further comments or further questions, then I'll do my best to answer. You can also go to the Hotspotting website and look at the location reports page to get a little bit more information about areas you might be interested in, and there's also that strategy session, which I think is a really good value for money way for people to find out a little bit more detail with the questions, because we're a little bit limited in this format by how much detail I can give you in an answer. But if you've got specific questions which relate to your circumstances and your particular objectives, in that strategy session we can have a 45-minute chat, and we can really actually dig down into strategies, goals, locations that suit, and sorts of property that might be appropriate to your circumstances. So give that some thought. That's probably it for now. Just keep in mind that we do these live Q&As once a month, early in the month. We always well advertised on the website and our Facebook page. So keep checking that out to be aware when the next one's coming up, and also be aware that every Tuesday evening now I have a live broadcast feature called Hotspot of the Week, and so it's always useful to tune into that and find out which area I'm going to feature. It may not be an area that you specifically thought you're interested in, but I'm going to be highlighting the areas that we really rate. To date, we've talked about areas like Townsville, like Ballarat, like the Joondalup area, and up in the northern suburbs of Perth. And tomorrow I'll be featuring another area. And I'm not going to tell you what it is. You'll have to tune in to find out what it is. But that's every Tuesday evening, 7:30 in the eastern states, 7 o'clock in the middle states, and 5:30 in Western Australia. So that's the Pirate Night hotspot of the month. And that's a pretty good note, I think, to finish on. Thanks for tuning in. Thanks for all your questions and your comments. Hope you found it useful. Feel free to follow up with an email or further comments on the Facebook page, and check out the Hotspotting website, particularly the location reports page. Okay, that's it. Terry Ryder from Hotspotting signing off. Great to be talking to you tonight. Enjoyed it. Always enjoy these live Q&As. Hope you got some value from it, and we'll do it again in a month's time. Thanks. That's it for now.